This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Hi folks, this is Mark Bittman from Food with Mark Bittman, and I'm going to share some money-saving tips when it comes to shopping at Whole Foods Market. It's great to be a Prime member when you shop at Whole Foods Market because you get an extra 10% off all sales, excluding alcohol. On Tuesdays, take advantage of deals like buy one, get one 50% off on packaged soups and $2 off of their no antibiotics ever rotisserie chicken. Huge Friday savings on ready-to-eat sushi rolls, 12 for $12 all live oysters, any hot one-topping pizza for just $12, and there are even more deals. There are so many ways to save at Whole Foods Market, and now you know.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
So where specifically are we?
Well, really, right in the heart of the market.
And this is basically a retail store that is full to the ceiling, shelves absolutely stacked with all sorts of nuts.
So we've got the cob nuts there, you've got raw, roasted, and then you've got your British walnuts down here. These varieties, the Franquette, the Broadview, they've still got those available. The new season stuff will have about 20 different varieties, some only a handful, others, tons. And upstairs we've got stewing some pickled walnuts, which were picked in July, so they'll be ready come the winter. They're just steeping now.
Wall-to-wall nuts. That's the opening scene for this week's programme, where we are tracking a food that is coming to the fore as a potential solution to both our health and the impact our diet is having on the planet. Could nuts be the fix we've been waiting for? Or at least one of them? Regular listeners may remember a similar wonder food from our two-parter on beans last year. But now it's the turn of another small, unassuming food that could, if we allow it, open many doors.
That's so clever because you just cracked a load of walnuts in seconds.
Yeah.
God, I just love fresh walnuts.
So my name's Charlie Tebbett, and I run Food and Forest, which is a company dedicated to expanding the use of nut agroforestry here in the UK.
I feel like I'm in a rocket, to be honest, but actually it's the trains going overhead, which is the quintessential backdrop to Borough Market, I think. Right, so what have we got?
So these are from a mix of different places. So the main one we use is in Maidstone. We work very closely with a mother and daughter duo, Cynthia and Annabelle. They've got an orchard there that's planted, I think, about 50 years ago. It's really one of the best producing orchards we have here in the UK.
So we've got two types of hazelnut on this plate.
So that one, you've got Tonda Gentile, so that is your Italian variety, and then you've got the cob nut next to them, which is the English version of hazelnut as well. So
they look completely different. So I'm going to try both. Oh wow, the Italian ones taste really hazelnutty. Okay, let me try a cob nut. Oh, it's different, but really nice.
Kind of a sweeter, a bit more complex, fruitier flavour to the cob nuts. Then you've just got like the pure creaminess of the Tonda Gentile.
You seem to be one of the few people that we could find that are actively selling British-grown nuts. Can you explain how this all came about?
So I studied in 2016 postgrad qualification about agroforestry. And
agroforestry, put simply, that is farming with trees.
I think when we see the trees, which I cannot wait, we can go into more about how it's grown. I feel like sometimes when we buy nuts in the shop and you look at where are these nuts from, it will say sort of unknown or from various countries. So is it quite unusual to sort of know exactly where your nuts are coming from?
I mean, people raise their eyebrows. It's not really considered the norm in the nut world, if you will, to be bothered about that, So that's why we like to do things a little bit different.
What I'm interested to know is what happens to these nuts before they get into the shop.
So they'll be dried, they'll be dehusked, and then they'll be shelled and sorted, and then they'll be cooked up into the final product as well. So that happens down at the warehouse.
Okay, I think and it's not that far from here, is it?
Not that far. Yeah.
Should we go check it out?
We'll be returning to Charlie to trace the journey of his nuts backwards, from market to processing warehouse to nut orchard. As we do so, we'll hear how a new era of quality British-grown nuts is starting to emerge. We started this programme with two simple questions. Why are nuts so good for you? And where do your nuts come from? But the answers turned out to be more than we bargained for. This food, which once would have been central to the diet of our ancestors, is now often treated as a nice-to-have health choice. It's a food we need to reconnect with, and to do so, we can learn from both the latest science and other food cultures.
Nuts really is almost in every corner of the cuisine. We just grow up having a handful of nuts in our hands.
But we also found out that how we eat nuts, whole, ground, in butters or milks, affects how much of their benefits we receive.
If you eat whole nuts, so if we take whole almonds as an example, because of their structure, actually about 30% of the calories is actually excreted.
Our nut journey also took us across the world, from cashew plantations in West Africa, processing plants in Southeast Asia, markets in Turkey, and walnut orchards in Kent. Not to mention a little diversion into California's organised crime rings. Because there is another story here about how high demand has a price. Ready to crack on? Sorry, I couldn't resist. I'm Leyla Kazim, and this is the Food Programme. I don't know when the last time you inspected a pack of nuts was, but take a closer look next time, and more likely than not, there will be a little phrase on there doing a whole lot of heavy lifting. Nuts from multiple origins. It actually hides a whole global supply chain. In cashews, for example, nuts grown in Côte d'Ivoire or Ghana are often shipped to Vietnam for processing before being exported back to the US, Europe or the UK. Sound bonkers? Wait until you hear the story about the nut heist worth $10 million. It turns out nuts are more than a little, well, nuts. But first things first, are they really that good for us?
I'm Professor Sarah Berry, and I'm an academic at King's College London, where I research the relationship between diet and cardiovascular disease. I'm also the chief scientist at Zoe. So I think there's really convincing evidence regarding the beneficial health effects of nuts. We know from population studies that people who eat more nuts tend to have lower rates of cardiovascular disease, lower rates of type 2 diabetes, and also potentially lower rates of living with obesity as well. There's also really good evidence from the gold standard that we use in research, which is randomised clinical trials. And what we know is these clinical trials show consistently that if you eat nuts, you have a reduction in inflammation, in blood pressure, in cholesterol, so particularly your bad cholesterol, your LDL cholesterol, and an improvement in insulin sensitivity.
A pretty convincing lineup of health benefits. But there is a twist. It appears not all nuts are created equal.
Given that actually in the UK only 7% of people report eating nuts, this is some recent analysis that we did in our department, I think that there's huge potential for us to encourage people to increase nut intake. Obviously, it's important to caveat that for some people, unfortunately, this isn't possible if they do have allergies. We actually know the form in which we eat the nuts matters. And this is something I've been researching for many years at King's College London, looking at how the structure of the nuts, what we call the food matrix, impacts its subsequent health effects. And it's fascinating because nuts are considered, really high fat. And, I hear many people say, oh my gosh, I mustn't eat nuts because they're so high in fat. But actually, if you eat whole nuts, so if we take whole almonds as an example, because of their structure, actually about 30% of the calories, so about 30% of the fat is actually excreted. And this is because nuts have very rigid cell walls. They have millions and millions of cells within them that are quite resistant to digestion. So what happens is when you chew, for example, an almond nut, typically you swallow a particle that's about 1 millimeter. But the cell size of most nuts, it's tiny, it's less than a grain of sand. So we're talking kind of micrometers. So what happens is when you swallow that nut, actually all of these cells nearly are intact at the point at which you swallow them, which means they're encapsulating all of the calories and the fat within them, which is why you have about 30% actually coming out in your poo, the other end, and we've measured this.
So what about all those products that include ground nuts? The butters, spreads, even the milks.
Now, this is where it gets interesting, because if you start grinding the nuts and grinding them in the way that you would in a commercial setting, where you're actually breaking all of these tiny cells, so then suddenly you'll be absorbing the whole 170 calories per portion. So for some people that might be beneficial, but for people who, are concerned about their weight, the evidence firstly shows that actually eating any whole nuts isn't associated with weight gain. And this mechanistic evidence that we have also shows why it is. As with everything, it is a little bit complicated to really clearly say which kind of ground nut is better or worse for us, because every process differs. Now, as a kind of rule of thumb, the kind of grinding that you would do maybe at home to create a nut butter, if you were creating one at home, would not be sufficient enough to fracture all of these cells. Many of the nut butters that you buy commercially, you have some grinding of the cells, but actually it would be a lot less than, some of these commercial processes that are used to create marzipan, for example, where you need a really finely ground almond powder. Then that would fracture most of the cells, and therefore that would change how much of the fat and how much of the energy was available. Many people are choosing nut milks because they think, wow, nuts are so healthy, then I must get this great benefit as well from nut milks. That magical structure of nuts that I've talked about is also destroyed.
Health messages from scientists like Sarah are starting to cut through. And that is having a huge effect on the nut industry.
There's been a huge increase in demand for nuts in the past few years, and there are various reasons for that.
That's Yara Zika, a specialist nut and dried fruit market reporter at commodity research firm Expanna.
The main thing is shift towards a plant-based diet. Whether you're looking at a healthier dietary habits, meat alternatives or dairy alternatives. A lot of consumers, they're looking at products like beans and lentils, pulses in general, tofu, these kind of products too. And nuts is one of the categories as well.
So just how big is this demand?
Cashews, almonds, these are the largest ones, these two. Hazelnuts or maybe walnuts, pecans, pistachios. I would say the production in all these different nuts is growing. So, for example, cashews last year, Vietnam exported the largest ever volume. And I would think looking forward, we're also looking at a huge growth because this plant-based trend is not going away.
Yara Zika of market research firm Expanna. And there are some issues with that growth. We'll come on to that shortly. But first, we're nipping back to meet Charlie again, who has driven us down the road about 10 minutes from where we started at Borough Market.
And we are now where?
We are at Spa Terminus in Bermondsey. So we're here under the arches in this groupings of like-minded food businesses.
It's under refurbishment, it's getting painted, but what is the plan for this space?
We're going to create a nut shelling facility where people can bring their nut crops from the British climates and we can process them at scale and produce the final kernel product.
You sound quite excited by this. Is this a big deal?
It's been a massive piece of work, really. It's been something we worked on for the last 4 years, is perfecting that process, because there's the dehusking, the shelling, and then the sorting, all quite minor things when you're doing it by hand, but to try and do that at scale in a really efficient, cost-effective way is what we've been working on. So I'm very pleased that we've got the machines that are going to be able to do that now.
Okay, so you're standing quite proudly next to this bright orange machine.
This is quite non-sophisticated machine, really. It just batters through the coblets when they're in the husks, and you have to get rid of this leafy material in order for them to go through the cracker effectively.
So that would be stage one of the processing. Then what's the next stage?
What we had to do is get it specifically engineered to deal with the ovulus shape, so it works in a way that agitates them to make sure they can crack effectively. So this has been one of the big things over the last 3 years. So this kind of unassuming little sheller, we can do about 3 tons a day the way it's set up. So
3 tons of nuts?
Yeah.
This tiny thing?
Yeah.
I'm amazed.
I know. Packs a punch, doesn't it?
It's like a foot tall.
Shall I put it on?
Let's rock and roll. We did a programme a while ago on beans, and part of that was showing how the processing can really influence the flavour of the end product. Does this apply to nuts? Does the processing affect the flavour of the end product?
Massively. Yeah. It's really one of the areas we're quite keen to explore now we have this, to have more leeway in what we do, exactly how we dry it, for example. There's this recipe that I really want to try in the Noma cookbook, which is like black hazelnuts, so like black garlic, when you ferment it, it brings out this richness, really, really complex flavours. We could do the same with cob nuts, and I just have this feeling like it's going to be a Nutella 5.0 or something. It's just going to be delicious. I'd like to almost see it become mainstream, combining nut crops and cereal farms be kind of a normal way of farming that's got a proven viability to it, both financially and environmentally, and it would be a win-win.
So we're going to leave Bermondsey and the processing area, and I'm very excited because we're going to head to some nut orchards.
Yes.
You're going to drive us there, aren't you?
Yes.
In Kent.
Yes.
Okay, let's go. Woohoo.
All right.
Let's pick up some lunch on the way.
Before we join Charlie down in the orchards, we're going to zoom out again briefly. And that's because, unlike Charlie's short and transparent supply chains, the vast majority of the nuts we can buy are grown and exported on a huge scale. As a result, very little information about where they come from actually reaches us, the consumers. That's something NGO Mighty Earth highlighted in a report producer Nina Pullman came across, which looked in detail at the supply chain for cashews. And as we heard earlier, cashews are one of the most widely eaten nuts in the world.
My name's Thea Parson. I'm a senior climate and forest associate at Mighty Earth. The world's largest producer of cashew nuts is Côte d'Ivoire, but cashews are also grown in other West African countries. And so we were really interested in looking into that supply chain because the cashew industry is a little bit of a mystery. If you go into a supermarket in the UK and you look at a packet of cashew nuts, it will often say mixed origin, or it might list 7 or 8 different countries. And so we wanted to investigate that industry and that supply chain and understand more about it so that we could see if there are any social and environmental issues that might be associated with it.
And what did you find? Can you summarise the key findings?
We saw that the cashew industry provides a really great source of income to farmers, particularly in the north of Côte d'Ivoire. As an industry, it's a bit less labour intensive at the farm level. So it's very appealing for farmers to grow cashew. On a tree, it actually appears as a fruit. It's known as a cashew apple, and the little cashew nut grows attached to this fruit, which almost looks like a red bell pepper. And once it's ripe, the farmer will separate the cashew nut from the fruit and leave that cashew nut to dry in the sun before sending it to a processing facility where it will be roasted and then deshelled. That can either be done by hand or it's done using a machine. And then they'll be sent to be packaged largely in Vietnam and India before then making their way to consuming countries.
Why does it go to Asia before going to the end destination?
India and Vietnam have just long been the largest kind of processing countries for cashew nuts.
And are there any concerns around that, particularly that processing side of it?
When cashew nuts are processed manually, quite a caustic oil is released from the cashew nut, and that oil can often cause skin irritations, burns and rashes on workers' hands and forearms. So making sure that the correct protective equipment is given to workers is really important. It is a concern, and it's something that all actors in the cashew industry need to make sure they are looking into and making sure that workers are protected throughout the supply chain.
And then going back to the farming side, what were your findings around that side of things?
The number of cashew farms has increased hugely across northern Côte d'Ivoire. What that means is that farmers are reducing their production of more subsistence crops like yams, which were used to feed households. If you replace that native, diverse farming with a monoculture crop like cashew, there is a risk of biodiversity loss.
What are you hoping some of the actions would be?
The aim behind our report was to really show consumers and show the world what the cashew industry looks like. Where do your cashew nuts come from? To kind of give consumers the information and the ability to understand more about the food that they're eating so that they can go to their retailers and ask them, what are you putting in place to ensure that they're being grown sustainably and that you're supporting workers in that supply chain? We have seen some really positive initiatives. Aldi, for example, have put in place a scheme where they do share where their cashews are grown. They provide a QR code where consumers can scan that QR code and they can look at the journey of their cashew nut from farm through to the supermarket. But there still needs to be a widespread effort throughout the industry to ask those questions.
I mean, who do you ask? Because one thing that strikes me is there's no point asking the sales assistant, is there, on the checkout?
I'd say that it's not solely the consumer's responsibility for the environmental or social concerns in a food supply chain, but just start asking those questions, whether that's via a letter to your retailer, whether it's just having these conversations. And that has this knock-on effect that those retailers will then have to ask their traders, and the traders will ask their suppliers, and then they're able to provide those solutions and support to farmers and to those in the processing facilities.
Thea Parson, Senior Climate and Forest Associate at Mighty Earth and author of their report into cashews. In that spirit of asking questions, we got through to OFI, one of the world's biggest nut suppliers, for their perspective on this.
My name is Burcu Türkay. I'm the Global Head of Sustainability for the nuts business at OFI. Probably most people haven't heard of OFI, but anyone who likes coffee, chocolate, cashews, or chili sauce has almost certainly enjoyed our ingredients. So if we specifically go into the nuts, we offer all the major nuts, including almonds, cashews, and hazelnuts, in a variety of roasts and formats from whole, chopped, flour, paste, and protein powders. And we source our nuts from 15 different origins. I mean, I'm based in Turkey, and the majority of hazelnuts coming from Turkey in the Black Sea region in the northern part. And small holders are producing the hazelnuts. So in Turkey, it's more than 450,000 hazelnut farmers. Harvest is happening once every year. So the farmers depend the rest of the 11 months on that income.
In terms of your cashew supply chain, how does that all work?
Similar type of farmers. We're talking about small farm holders.
How many farmers do you work with roughly in Côte d'Ivoire?
Currently, in our sustainability programs in Côte d'Ivoire and cashews, we have 20,000 farmers.
Is that all of them, or you have kind of a portion who are not in the schemes as well?
Yes, we are sourcing cashews from more than 100,000 farmers.
I know that there are some concerns in some parts of the industry around health and safety for workers around the processing. What does OFI do to protect its workers?
Processing in our facilities is fully mechanized. So those health and safety concerns are before being fully mechanized. And all our employees are provided with the industrial PPEs.
I understand you're also in almonds as a category.
The picture for almonds is very different because we're not talking about small pondholders anymore. So we're talking about big growers, mainly in the United States and Australia. So when we look at California, where 80% of almonds are grown, that's a region prone to drought.
What's the total acreage that you have in that region?
Together with the US and Australia, we have 50,000 acres.
Gosh, that's a lot of almonds, isn't it?
Yes.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head to head for the last chicken wing. Shop game day faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Burcu Turkay, Global Head of Sustainability at ingredients company OFI. Speaking of Californian almonds, at this point, we're going to hand the story over to someone new. And that person is journalist and podcaster Mark Fennell.
I often re-listen to it and think, how the hell did I get here? So I'm investigating stolen nuts. I think within about 48 hours of being in the Central Valley of California where these thefts took place, I found myself in a flak jacket in the back seat of a car with private investigators driving at twilight through these nut fields while they, just casually tell you about how, they found a dead body over there because that's where the cartels dump their bodies, because where's better to dump a body? And I was like, I love this job, but sometimes you sit there and go, what?
What Mark's talking about is an investigative food podcast / true crime series he made in 2020 called Nut Jobs. Here's what happened.
A couple of years ago, about $10 million worth of nuts disappeared from the Central Valley of California, which is where the bulk of nuts are grown in America. Almonds, a few other varieties, but almonds are the main one. And it was confusing because the thing with when you steal food is that the evidence invariably gets eaten, and it just disappeared into the ether. But actually what turns out was it was actually part of a very high-tech, well-planned heist where you had independent truck drivers who were being signed up to pick up loads online. And actually what had happened was the trucking systems were hacked so that you had truck drivers participating in a heist, picking up loads, getting it signed off by farmers, and then dropping it at different locations where it'd be picked up by another truck driver, and it would disappear into the night. And what we uncover eventually is that those nuts, in many cases, ended up going out of the United States through the port of LA. It started off as a very simple, quirky story, which I think journos often find themselves making, but actually the tendrils of this crime started to reach into all other parts of American life, farming, the environment, how water is sucked out of the ground. And it became this sort of epic tale of food that starts with probably one of the weirder crimes I think I've ever encountered.
Let's park the crime itself for a second, because while investigating it, Mark started to understand something about how these vast amounts of almonds are produced, which is relevant to our story.
There has been such a huge influx of desire for nut-based products as people moving away from meat and dairy. This particular category of nuts has shot up in value drastically in a relatively short period of time. That means that somebody somewhere is suddenly getting very, very rich. If you can hive off a truck here, a truck there, and, you know, a single one of these trucks is in the millions of US dollars, right, in terms of its value on the black market. In reality, all of these farms are industrial sized. A lot of them are either owned or have investment from major corporations. Think about how much easier it is to steal from a corporation in terms of your level of guilt than to steal from what you recognise as a family business. And so through investigating this weird, very odd crime, it became clear that a huge chunk of the nuts that we consume around the world were all coming from this valley in California. In order to grow these nuts, you needed to pump a truly extraordinary amount of water out of the groundwater to irrigate them, to the point that I think the ground in the Central Valley has basically sunk several metres because of how much water they've taken out of the ground. The reason nuts have taken off, it's perceived as a healthy food, and indeed it is in many ways, but it comes with huge environmental concerns that we often don't think about, right? So perhaps it is healthier for humans to some degree, but it's not necessarily healthy for the earth. And so in order to sustain this sudden massive demand around the world, you're often relying on undocumented people who live in these like villages right next to the nut farms. Their lives are hard.
This is the crux of why we wanted to talk to Mark. What happens when there is a boom in popularity for a certain food? High demand equals high impact, understandable. But what should or even can we do with this information?
I think just be mindful, like when anything shoots up in value suddenly, somebody somewhere will be looking to see how they can take advantage of that. And that's on us, right? That's on you, that's on me to kind of interrogate when something shoots up in value and go, I wonder why and who's benefiting from that. And it became very apparent to me quite early on that we simply, as consumers, never think about the sheer number of lives and impact of what we eat. And I think that's what became more interesting to me at a certain point. Like the crime is fascinating and it's weird and it's strange, but actually the bigger crime is how little we consider how our food gets there. And I'm sympathetic, right? Because we can't, every time you add an ingredient to a meal, every time I sit down to cook dinner for my kids, you cannot possibly conceive, right, of all of the different stories that go into play on that plate. But if we could just pay attention to one or two, we would realise the enormity of the enterprise that is the modern diet. I remember just being quite humbled by it. There's a moment at the end of the series where I sort of stand on the top of a mountain range looking out over the fields, and those mountain ranges used to have tons of running water that would run into the valley. And thanks to climate change, it's becoming less and less a reliability, which means they are going to need to pull up more water from the ground. And with that comes a deep sense of foreboding. You have to recognise that something very big is coming, and that's just one ingredient.
Mark Fennell with his tale of nut crime and the industrialised health food supply chain behind it. And now, from one nut thief to another, if slightly smaller and furrier. Oh, we can see all the shells that the squirrels have had a field day with. So, I mean, we need to talk about squirrels and the fact that you grow nuts because the two together kind of seem at odds.
It's very dispiriting when sometimes I arrive first thing in the morning, you see like half of Noah's Ark here. You got badgers, the crows, the squirrels. They're having an absolute field day. Half
We're back with Charlie, who by now has driven us out of London to a walnut orchard at East Malling in Kent.
Oh my gosh, no, it's like a lemon. I mean, okay, so what's the name of this tree again? Germisara, a variety of walnut with absolutely huge nuts. Why are you laughing, Neen? They're about the size of lemons. Some of them. Wow. It's really impressive.
We're in East Malling. We're at the East Malling Trust at the Bradbourne House, and we're looking at the walnut orchard. So we've got 120 different trees here. They're all planted on the sides of this driveway, and each one is a different variety.
Why have they got So many different varieties.
This was planted back in the early 2000s, as a bit of a test bed to see what kind of varieties would produce the best in the Kentish climate.
So are you saying that you basically, at various points of the year, sell 120 different types of walnut?
Well, not quite. We have a good 20 to 30 of these we'll produce in any way reasonable. You know, there's 3 ways to really consume a walnut. You can have it green, and you can pickle them, and they have the same texture as kind of pickled beetroot. But then when you harvest them fresh in October, they come out as kind of white. That's called wet walnuts. They're available in October. They're only available for, say, a week, 2 weeks max, because they need to be dried pretty soon, otherwise they do go mouldy. They taste really quite different, a little bit sappy, milkier, fresher texture and feel to them. And then you would dry them down. You can keep them through the year, and really in November, December is when they'll be at their best.
So I understand that there are sort of more and more farmers who are choosing to bring in nut trees into their fields. Can you explain to us a little bit more about that and why they're doing that?
It's a good way of obviously diversifying your crop if you're too reliant on one particular product. We tend to, at the moment, you go to these conferences or whatever, people tend to be approaching it from the environmental standpoint.
Because I can imagine there are farmers who have planted nut trees that aren't yet, producing, but they will in a few years, and they haven't necessarily thought about what they're going to do with those nuts.
Yeah.
Is that where you come in?
Yeah, exactly.
So can you just explain a little bit about how nut trees on a farm would work with other crops and animals?
Hazelnuts, for example, cob nuts, work extremely well if you combine it with, say, chickens, turkeys or other kind of poultry. They work in a symbiotic relationship because the turkeys especially are very good at grubbing out weevil, which is one of the biggest pests associated with hazelnut production. There's a strong business case for this as well. You're not having to sacrifice your living for environmental credentials. You're able to add to your living and do something positive for the environment. So,
do you think it's possible for British-grown hazelnuts and walnuts to scale up and end up replacing the amount that we import?
I think it would be disingenuous if I said yes. We are never going to be at the scale of California or Australia because we've got too much demands on how we use land in this country, and that's fine. I don't think it's necessarily something we should aim for in trying to compete on volumes, but we could create something, like with the Kentish coblet, which has this local distinctiveness, which has this immense flavour. I don't think it would work if we started to compete as a pure commodity. They're also beautiful as well. I think that is important to emphasize as well. It's like you create a beautiful landscape that people want to be in. You want to take a walk in an agroforestry farm. You want to go and spend a bit more time there. I think the fact that you create beauty in the landscape is important as well.
So if a listener wanted to buy British grown nuts now, where could they find them?
Farmers markets, but it tends to be quite local. People in Kent are familiar with it because this is where it's grown. It tends to be the local markets around here. Online, there's a couple of sellers, myself included.
But they're not kind of jumping out at us, are they, British grown nuts? It's a bit of you have to sort of make an effort to look for them either online or in a shop.
Programs like this are incredibly helpful, so getting the word out, getting it more into common public perception that nuts can grow in this country and that we have, albeit nascent, but it's growing at a pace.
I'm excited for the British nut growing future. I think it could be really big because just everyone wants to eat more of them. And I didn't even know prior to really doing this show that walnuts could grow in the UK. So that is a whole revelation for me.
Clearly, we're at a bit of a tipping point for British nuts, even if they aren't about to replace global imports. But wherever they come from, there are some compelling reasons to add more nuts into our diets. Remember Professor Sarah Berry and the difference in whole and ground nuts? Well, she also has some tips on when we could eat them.
I think the best single strategy is to incorporate them as snacks. We recently completed a study at King's where we actually replaced people's typical snacks as consumed in the UK with nuts to see how this over a period of 6 weeks impacted various risk factors related to cardiovascular disease. We saw a significant reduction in LDL cholesterol, which is our bad cholesterol, and we saw a really big improvement in blood vessel function. This is a huge health benefit from just one single simple dietary strategy. And so I'd really encourage people to try and think about, can they change the typical UK snack, which typically, are high in salt, high in saturated fat, low in fibre, with nuts, then you're going to have this huge benefit. But actually, I think that regardless of when you eat them and how you're eating them, I think that nuts are such a powerhouse of nutrients that you should eat them however it works for you.
Swap your snack for some nuts. Got that? There is also much to be learned from food cultures around the world who eat nuts as a much more significant part of their diet. One of those is particularly close to my heart, being half Turkish Cypriot through my dad. So to end our nut journey, I arranged to meet Turkish chef and food writer Özlem Warren at her local Turkish supermarket in Cheam, South London.
So this is my second home. When I'm in the UK, it's about 30 minutes drive to me. It's Cheam Food Arena. It's a lovely kind of food hall. There's this beautiful abundance of seasonal produce.
So is this where you buy your nuts from?
I come here for nuts too, yes.
Shall we go inside and see? I mean, let's have a look at the nut display. So we're in this shop in the UK and the Turkish nuts are sold in these small packets.
Yeah.
But when we're in Turkey, they're not sold like this, are they? How are they sold?
You have a big scoop, you get your bag, put your, like I said, kilo of pistachios, kilo of badem, and then he weighs it and puts it, and he said, I'm traveling, vacuum pack, seals it, vacuum pack. Here I am, come with a luggage full of nuts. It is nuts, but we ate so much. And then if you go to Gaziantep, the fıstık Gaziantep pistachios, I think it's the best pistachios in earth. They call it green emeralds. Wow. It goes into katmer pastry, it goes into baklava. We not only use the cherez nuts in sweet stuff, but it goes into savory stuff, to Circassian chicken, for instance. It has that lovely walnut sauce with garlic and coriander and whatnot.
One of the big differences, I think, between the way we consume nuts here in the UK and the way people in Turkey consume nuts is that in Turkey, people will just happily eat the nuts on their own.
Absolutely.
And not necessarily because of the health benefits or because it's a health food. It's such a part of the culture, I feel. Like it's a normal thing.
We just grow up having a handful of nuts in our hands.
Are there any traditions or celebrations that involve nuts in some way? You know what, I'm thinking of weddings.
Yeah, candied almonds. I had it in my wedding, so once they are cool, they put in little bags. That brings good luck, and everyone would get a handful of them. Perdeli badem pilav, it's a special rice that's covered in a pastry with almonds kind of embedded to it. So, nuts really is almost in every corner of the cuisine.
In the UK, the demand for nuts is really increasing because people are better understanding the health benefits.
Absolutely.
And also people kind of choosing to eat less meat and fulfill that protein quota in other ways. And then you've just written a vegetarian cookbook.
Indeed.
Which is going to include nuts.
I was browsing through yesterday just to see, oh my God, literally huge part of it is nuts. And of course it is a bit of an optional thing because of the allergies, you're mindful of that, but naturally it is embedded in the cuisine.
It's just amazing, isn't it? Nuts and seeds, the thing that everyone's like, you need to eat more of because it's so healthy, and the Turks just consume this stuff by the bucket load normally anyway.
And it's so easy to incorporate into your daily food. You can add it to your salads, you could add it to your rice. I always sprinkle a little bit here and there in my pasta.
You can just add it to everything and it works.
Yeah. It's like kids in a candy store. Yes! And it's a celebration really, because it's so delicious. And go to Turkey, guys, and get sacks full of it.
Get suitcases full.
Suitcases full of it, like Özlem does.
Özlem Warren teaching us about the joy of nuts. And what a way to end our journey through this fascinating food. So the next time you pick up a packet of nuts or sprinkle some into your lunch, perhaps you might also consider what format you eat them in and where they came from. I know I will. This episode of the Food Programme was presented by me, Leyla Kazim, and produced by Nina Pullman for BBC Audio in Bristol.
To make switching to the new Boost Mobile risk-free, we're offering a 30-day money-back guarantee.
So why wouldn't you switch from Verizon or T-Mobile?
Because you have nothing to lose. Boost Mobile is offering a 30-day money-back guarantee.
No, I asked why wouldn't you switch from Verizon or T-Mobile?
Oh.
Wouldn't.
Because you love wasting money as a way to punish yourself because your mother never showed you enough love as a child?
Whoa. Easy there.
Yeah.
Applies to online activations. Requires port in and auto pay. Customers activating in stores may be charged non-refundable activation fees.
This podcast is brought to you by Wise, the app for doing things in other currencies. With Wise, you can manage your money across borders, pay bills for your properties abroad, send funds to your overseas wedding vendors. You can even use Wise to spend in the local currency while on vacation without the hassle of a currency exchange kiosk. Send and spend money worldwide at the exchange rate you'll usually see on Google. And with no hidden fees, you'll know exactly what you're paying every time. Join over 12 million customers. See how Wise could work for you by downloading the app or visiting wise.com.